Hello and welcome to another edition of BM Talks with me, Helen Thomas, founder and CEO of Blonde Money. And it is another by-election special and a returning guest, which is Rob Ford. Hello, Rob.
Hello.
And Rob, you may well remember, Professor of Politics at Manchester University. And hot off the press, he is the new Sky News Elections Analyst. So we're very grateful to have you, Rob.
Pleasure to be here, Helen.
And I'm sure there'll be more and more of this to come. I should also say, interestingly, in your day job, you are currently marking papers. It was very nice of you to take a bit of time out to talk to us about this very important by-election. But you are marking papers, I believe, with the essay title of "How Economic Crises End Governments" or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, do economic crises do for governments? Can governments win re-election after an economic crisis or not? Is more or less the broad topic of the question. The general
Mm.
pattern is no, which may or may not be bad news for whoever wins the Makerfield by-election.
Yes. Great. Well, I love it. Very, very relevant. Yes, so we are here to talk about Makerfield. Now, before we dive into the questions, I just want to say one thing, which I know you know as well, Rob, which is there is not actually a place called Makerfield. It is the name of the constituency, but there is a town there, and you'll talk about it, I'm sure, called Ashton in Makerfield. And one of my very good friends, I must say hello to his parents, Billy and Lynn, who live there, and would be very not happy if we started to not make it clear to everyone straight away this part of the Northwest. So that's right, isn't it, Rob? So tell us a bit about Makerfield.
Yes, that's correct, Helen. And I mean, it's an interesting continuation of a theme because with Gorton and Denton,
Yeah.
a lot of people in Westminster got Gorton and Denton wrong because they failed to realise that most of the seat was neither Gorton nor Denton, so the seat name was misleading. In this case, you have a seat called Makerfield, and if people are coming up from Westminster trying to find a place called Makerfield, they won't find one. The name actually originated. There's two towns called Ashton in Makerfield and Ince in Makerfield. Ince used to be in the seat. In fact, if you go back 50 or 60 years, it was called Ince rather than Make,
Mm.
but it got moved out of the seat. So there are two places with Makerfield in the name, but one of them isn't in the seat even, just to add to the confusion. But it's
Yeah.
kind of appropriate because this is a place that isn't quite what it seems on the
Mm.
surface. So a slightly misleading name for a place that's easy to mislead people, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
tell us. So tell us, let's dig into this seat. Who lives there? What kind of people? And then, of course, their voting history, I suppose, where they'd be inclined to vote this time. So, yeah, tell us what we need to know, I guess, with the demographics, maybe, to start with, of the seat.
Exactly. I mean, when I started to dig into this seat to sort of do a profile of it, my expectation was that it was going to be a very classic kind of red wall type seat. The seat does have a kind of long, deep history with the mining industry. This is where a lot of the Lancashire mining industry
Mm.
was based. And for roughly 80 years, they basically sent local miners to Westminster. That's what they did.
Yeah.
So you got a series of the very first one was a really fascinating contest because a local miner, the first Labour MP was a local miner who defeated a guy with a tremendous triple-barreled name who
Oh, we love
basically
those.
owned most of the local mines.
Yeah.
But that is ancient history now, really, in this area. I think what it does leave as a kind of cultural heritage, as it were, is a very strong attachment to the traditional Labour Party, a very strong sense of working class identity, and it's a very white seat as well.
Mm. Yeah.
This is, relative to say Gorton and Denton in Manchester, which we have is very ethnically diverse, big city seat. This is small town, semi-rural, very white, but, and it's a big but, it sits right in between Manchester and Liverpool. You
Yeah.
can commute to Manchester, you can commute to Liverpool, but the properties are bigger and they're cheaper and the schools are good and the
Mm.
roads are pretty good. So what is it now? It is in fact not a seat of horny-handed sons of toil, of miners going down beneath the surface. It is a seat of aspirational middle class commuters as much as anything.
Yeah.
You've got about 75% home ownership here. You've got very high rates of car commuting here. You've got pretty much national average rates of employment here. So, although you have this very distinctive and very kind of, you know, traditional romantic Labour heritage in terms of the mining industry, and people who lived here all their lives are still very attached to all of that. It's a very big sense of the place.
Mm.
You've also got layered on top of that what would look like. I mean, if you were to just describe the seat in the abstract, it would sound potentially like a seat in Essex,
Yeah.
a seat on the edge of the London commuter belt, where you'd say straightforwardly, this is probably going to be a Tory leading seat or a swing seat. But it's not. It's never ever done anything except return Labour MPs.
Yes.
Um, so it is Red Wall in kind of its heritage and identity. It is not Red Wall in terms of the kind of people who live here, but it is also very, very Labour. The other thing that surprised me about the seat is it's never really done, UKIP have never really done very well here, going
Mm.
back into earlier periods. Boris didn't win here in 2019, unlike, for example, Lee next door, which used to be Andy Burnham's seat. Lee flipped to the Conservatives as part of the big sort of Red
Mm.
Wall wave. This seat did not. And although there's been a lot of talk, and for good reason, about the huge wave of gains that Reform made in the local elections here last week, they won every single ward in this seat. If you go back further in time, there isn't evidence of this seat being very consistently a seat with a radical right leaning. It's not like, you go and look at places like Boston and Skegness, Grimsby, the Lincolnshire type areas, Essex as well, Thurrock and so on. You'll see like big UKIP votes in like the 2010s. You don't see that
No.
here at all. So it's a really, really interesting seat. I mean, if I were like Andy Burnham's campaign manager and I was saying, could you design me a seat that would demonstrate that I can appeal beyond what is now the traditional Labour electoral coalition, a socially mixed commuter seat with relatively few graduates and relatively few ethnic minorities? It's more or less central casting for
Yeah.
making that case. So it is, yeah, I mean,
It is. It's well, it is. I think that's a extremely good points to make about how, in many ways, for the candidate, for Andy Burnham himself, this is uh, it kind of well suited. And actually, as we keep hearing, but it is very true. If he can't win here, then there are bigger problems for the Labour Party. So in that sense, it's such a bellwether anyway, despite everything else that's riding on it. Just a moment to talk before we move away from the geography, because this is the other thing you mentioned. Lee, so Andy Burnham was the MP for Lee, the neighbouring seat. I believe his house is on a road that is between both constituencies. So anyway, but
He
here's
keeps
the
he keeps pointing down the road in his videos and saying, "I live down there."
yeah.
So clearly, it is very nearby. Yeah.
I mean, his daughters went to this school that you mentioned is a very good school there in the Makerfield constituency. Um, so he is local now. I was actually struck though. Do you know what's interesting to me about Andy Burnham? For anyone who knows anything about the Northwest, it's fascinating to me. A guy born in Aintree, grew up near Warrington, ends up went to Cambridge, worked as a Labour MP, down in Westminster, and then ends up being this hugely popular mayor of Manchester, Greater Manchester, and he's an Everton fan. So
Mm.
I was quite struck when you said that this particular seat is between Liverpool and Manchester, that perhaps again it might suit the kind of chameleonic um, elements of Andy Burnham, which amazingly he's played off pretty well to manage that, because there are very distinct local heritages here, right? I mean, you live up there nearby-ish. Well, you're in Manchester anyway, Rob, but tell us.
I am, yeah. And my son, who's a great example of local integration, because as you can hear from my accent, I wasn't born in Manchester, but he's got the thick Manchester accent, and he even supports Manchester United for his sins. So,
Oh, there we go.
integration in action. You're right though. The one of the other sort of stats that surprised me when I was like crunching the numbers on this, I tried the commuting times from Makerfield
Ah,
to
yeah.
Liverpool. It's actually, for most of the bigger towns in Makerfield, it's quicker to get into Liverpool than it is to get into Manchester. And I think that's probably reflected in where people come from and where people work. Um, I suspect it wasn't an accident that Andy donned his Everton shirt for his announcement, which you don't see as often when he's on
Mm.
the campaign trail in central Manchester.
No.
We need to hide it, but maybe he doesn't wear it all the time. I
Yeah.
suspect there probably are as many Liverpool and Everton fans around Makerfield as there are Manchester United fans, and it feels like a place that's got kind of cultural affinities to both big northwest cities. But that may be and this is me getting a bit arm waving speculative here, but I think,
Go
for
for it.
justified reasons, it may be another thing that's like playing in Labour's favour and possibly Burnham's favour too. I mean, Burnham can point to Liverpool and Manchester aspects to his heritage and identity. That's very helpful. But also, one thing we know about Merseyside is it's a massive outlier in terms of its voting behaviour, particularly in the last few decades.
Yeah.
It's very white, very working class, especially the outer boroughs of Merseyside. And yet there is an absolute monolithic unwillingness to go over to the right, either
Mm,
the Tories or really even UKIP either or Reform. The sort of Scouser identity seems to be a very strongly aligned with Labour identity. And that might account for why, for example, Makerfield stays Labour. Lee, just a few miles to the east, bit closer to Manchester, bit more of a Manchester identity, ends up going
yeah.
Tory. Maybe there were just enough Merseysiders here to keep it red. So that would probably play in Burnham's
Well, that's
favour.
interesting as well. With it was a Leave voting seat. Well, if you can
Very,
deduce it,
very,
but
yeah.
yeah, Makerfield. I mean, did
Both
vote.
of them were, yeah. I mean, both Mayfield and Lee
Right,
both two-thirds leave.
two
Um,
thirds Leave. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But there are other wrinkles to this whole story of
yes,
local identity and local politics, though, because Reform, perhaps learning their lesson from Gorton and Denton, where they picked a candidate who did his best to make himself sound like a local, but it wasn't really very convincing. They've picked a guy who could not be more local. I
yeah.
mean,
Born and bred, I think, as he keeps
yeah,
saying.
yeah. There's a kind of weird I'm more local than Youd sort of bidding war going on in the sea at the moment. So he's
Yes,
going about he's a local plumber. He's been sort of basically fixing local toilets his whole life. He loves Makerfield. He's never been anywhere but Makerfield. He never wants to go anywhere but Makerfield. And Burnham is going around saying, "My kids are at the school down there. I've lived here 20 years. Stop saying I'm not local." So, and in a way that's kind of charming because this is a sort of perennial of by-elections. People
yes.
love to emphasize their local credentials, but it's kind of acquired an almost surreal intensity in this case. But it's smart because he's not just a local. He is he's a working class kid, but he's not a novice. I mean, Reform because he's been like a little bit controversial. Some of his social media that they've dug up, they're like, oh, but he was just a plumber a couple of weeks ago. He's got no experience in politics. That's not really true. He's run for local office 3 years running for
Mm,
Reform, three different wards. So he's clearly been active in politics for Reform a while. Having watched some of his videos, I think he comes across very polished, very well. He's very good at telling that, local working class, not traditional political elite story. And of course, that enables you to get into the narrative of Andy Burnham went to Cambridge, Andy Burnham went to Westminster, Andy Burnham's abandoned places like Makerfield before, you can't trust it. So, in terms of a contrast candidate, they've done very well there. I
and we should say so. Reform came second, uh,
Yes,
in the last, well, in 2024.
yeah, and it was one of their strongest performances, and that's the other local politics wrinkle here is if you watch the Reform Guy's videos, you'll see him talking about how Makerfield has never had local MPs. They parachute people in. Now, never had local MPs is definitely not true, but the parachuting bit he's clearly referring to is he's punching a bruise from 2 years ago.
Yeah,
Makerfield featured one of the probably most contentious late selections by Labour. Josh Simons, formerly head of Labour Together, where he's been no stranger to controversy recently either. Basically, an apparatchik with no connection to the northwest. I mean, I believe he spent some of his early childhood in Bury, so that's the closest he has as a connection to the sea. But he went to school in Cambridge. He then went to do his doctorate in Harvard. Then he came back to be a policy wonk, and then days before nominations closed, the long-standing MP here retired, and he was parachuted in on, I believe, on a short list of one, or if it wasn't a short list of one, it was one of those situations where it was pretty clear who the NEC were going to pick, and that plays into, I think, the distinctive heritage of this seat because, like I mentioned, for 80 years, what they did here was send local miners straight out of the pit to
mm,
Westminster to basically stand up for the local people and industry of
mm,
Makerfield. So voters with longer memories and attachments to this seat would know that this was a place where it wasn't Labour tell you who your MP is. It was you tell Labour what you want for Makerfield. You
yeah.
send. represented. So I think Reform have been very astute picking up on that particular
Yes.
controversy and that particular resentment, and it presents. I think if anyone other than Andy Burnham was on the ballot, then it probably would be a sufficiently knockout argument for them to win with, particularly in an anti-Labour climate. But because Andy Burnham is himself someone who has a strong story to tell about, I'm not like the National Labour Party. I have argued with the National Labour Party. I'm not like Westminster. I have fought against Westminster for places like this. It's harder to pull off,
Yeah.
but it still gives them an in. I mean, this is why it's such a fascinating by-election, Helen.
Mm.
It really, you really can. Like here we are 2 weeks out from voting. You can construct a plausible story by which either candidate narrowly wins.
Yeah.
We don't know which story will be true, but you know, the, the, they're both going into this with clear strengths and weaknesses.
If we zoom out, then we've done lots of the, and I wanted to be hyper local because local is what we do keep hearing. And by the
Mm.
way, everyone should read the Swingometer, which is Rob's Substack, where he has some very witty captions to his photographs, which I enjoy about some of these local things being pointed out by local candidates. Um, but then we have this national significance, which I think, and I hate using this word, but I think it is unprecedented. And maybe Rob, you've got the political history knowledge, but have we ever really had such a specific by-election where the people of Makerfield look like they will be choosing the next prime minister?
I mean, there's only one by-election I know of where, the voters were essentially choosing the next prime minister, and that's when Alex Douglas Home ran in a very, very safe Tory seat. It was like 75%
Mm.
Tory, and he'd already been picked as prime minister, but by convention, he wanted to sit in the Commons. He was in the House of Lords at the
Oh
time.
yes, of course.
That was more like you already have a prime minister, but he needs a seat.
Yeah,
Whereas what's weird about this is Burnham is not the prime minister. He's not even officially a candidate to be prime minister or Labour leader, but everyone knows that's what's going on.
yeah,
So you get this really surreal situation where the by-election campaign is essentially hate Starmer, vote Labour.
yeah.
That's the kind of
Which
implicit
which
message.
also neutralises some of Reform's argument, I would
Yeah.
suggest, where Reform have done quite well, obviously in those local elections. They were, I think, explicitly campaigning on "Get Starmer out, vote Reform."
Yeah, that was their slogan. And if Burnham was keen to up Manchester's recycling rates, he could just take all of those leaflets and just Tipex out reform and put Burnham, vote Burnham, get Starmer out. That's basically the message here.
Well, it's
Uh,
quite. Can I just say, if people haven't seen the campaign literature, the picture, the poster that is "Vote Andy for Us" with a kind of
yeah,
cartoon picture of Andy Burnham, and somewhere in tiny writing you can't even see it says this is for the Labour Party and all the promotional stuff you have to put on for legal reasons. But it is quite astonishing, right? It's a red background, so I suppose
yeah.
that's your nod. But it's very much about Andy Burnham, not the Labour Party,
It-
isn't it?
It's it's red and yellow. They've even tried to sort of downplay the sort of
True.
red, But you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly personalized campaign material, clearly focused entirely on Andy Burnham. And that's because that's the circle they're trying to square. They can't actually, much as it would amuse me if they did run with vote Burnham, get Starmer out. But vote Andy for us. Well, for us versus what?
Mm,
Versus an out of touch Labour government versus reform. You can pick your enemy, but clearly it's not exactly a message that's about the merits of the current Labour government. Yet, because of the nature of the sort of Westminster game, you're having people interviewing him and saying, "Oh, would you support the current government?" And he's having to pretend that he does, and Starmer is having to pretend that he's fine with all of this. And my favourite one is they were asking, like, "Oh, would you like it if Keir Starmer came and campaigned in the seat?" Which is like, I
I
think the
know.
happiest person. If there was a really high-profile day of canvassing by Keir Starmer in the seat, I think the happiest person in the country would be Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
Very
Gosh,
strange.
I know.
No, I don't particularly want my leader to come and campaign in my seat.
No,
But
it's
yeah,
it's,
I
it's
mean,
not. I mean, it is really an astonishing moment in British political history, and I, I mean, for you and me as people who love politics, it's fascinating. It is. We often descend into hyperbole, I think, in political journalism, but actually, this time around, there is some merit to this fact. I do think that I'm sure the voters of Makerfield are aware. I think in many ways. I mean, do you have a view on that? Like my sense is if you feel like this person could then lead the country, in a way, I would think that if you were Labour leaning or you'd voted Labour in the past, it would make you more inclined to vote for Andy Burnham. I mean, unless you didn't like him for some reason. But yeah, what do you think of the element of? I mean, it's quite hard. There's no other real comparison for it. But how do you think it affects the voters in the constituency to weigh that up?
Well, I mean, I think the whole thing will turn on how voters understand this very unusual contest.
Yeah,
Because I mean, just to fire yet another stat at you, Helen,
please,
uh,
please do.
reform on every single ward in this constituency last month. So if voters treat it like they treated the local election last month, you would think that reform would be racing
Mm.
favourites. But Andy Burnham won the borough of Wigan by more than two-thirds in 2024.
Wow.
Um, which incidentally meant he ran well ahead of Labour, who also did quite well in that year. So if this was treated as a referendum on do you think Andy Burnham's a great guy, then he would like basically win it. But of course, the contest can't really straightforwardly be like the local elections because it's not. It's about electing a Westminster MP, and we know it's about electing a potential leader of the Labour Party. But nor can it be a referendum on Andy Burnham's performance as mayor because he's not running to be mayor. And in fact, some people may not like the fact that he's running away from the mayoral job. So, how are voters going to understand this choice? I mean, I think if you're a disaffected Labour voter, all the polling suggests you probably like Burnham more than Starmer.
Hmm.
Most of the voters that Labour have lost are the kind of people who like the kind of stuff they're hearing from Burnham more than they like the stuff that they're hearing from Starmer. But there's also an awful lot of recent recruits to reform in this seat. And
Mm.
how are they going to see this contest? Do they think, well, I really don't like Starmer and this is a chance for me to kick him out and Andy's okay, so that's fine for me? Or do they think, we really need to stop Burnham because he's the one thing that stands in the way of getting a reform government?
Yeah.
It,
Yeah, yeah. Yes, yes, you're right. Yeah. That's like a two level on yeah, it is that multi-stage game almost there, isn't it? Yeah, this is like a shadow race for the general election. I mean, it's almost being fought like a general election. I mean, quite amazingly, we've got a situation where, a Labour candidate is being asked about manifesto commitments. It's
yeah.
almost as if he's running. It's like a general election, and we're almost getting the opposition putting forward what they want, and so it's extremely.
Yeah, we've already had I mean, I was expecting this once he was running for the leadership, but before he's even had the by-election, we've already had a whole run of speculation about an early general election. You don't normally get speculation about an early general election in response to a
Yeah.
by-election campaign, and clearly that's all to do with. I mean, everyone seems to have just decided if Burnham wins this, he's just going to become prime minister. That's the sort of Westminster Village view. Um, Whether or not that's the average voter in Makerfield's view, I'm not sure. But clearly they know this is not like a normal by-election
Do you think
contest.
turnout will be higher as a result?
I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I
What's
think
normal? It's normally what, around two-thirds of general election turnout. Is it for by-elections or is that
it varies. I mean, normally in Labour seats, it drops more than in Conservative seats.
yeah.
But part of the reason for that is that Labour voters tend to be more responsive to the stakes and the context of an election. So therefore, you would expect that drop to be more mitigated by
Yes,
higher
by this being quite
higher
important.
savings. And in both Runcorn and Gorton and Denton, which is the two other by-elections in Labour seats you've had up here in the northwest,
Mm.
seems like this is where politics is
It
just happening.
is.
At the
It
moment.
is.
In both of those cases, the turnout was barely down from the general election, which is really very unusual. But
That's
that's
very
partly
unusual. That is
turnout
very
in both of
unusual.
those seats was very low in the previous general election. But also, it's just voters saw these were tight contests, high stakes. This is an even tighter contest with even higher
Yeah.
stakes. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually get turnout going up.
Yeah,
A
I'm
little
just thinking
more.
that it could easily be
Yeah.
higher. Yeah, because actually one thing that you're seeing as well, I think with both the campaigns. So, what again is by-elections are different from normal campaigns for the parties involved because they can tend to put a lot more resources into it. Um, we're being told that every single Labour MP is supposed to visit this constituency twice. I believe there are two heads of the campaign. I think there's even four of them. Apparently, it's thronging with Labour Party activists. I'm sure the people of Makerfield are absolutely fed up with getting knocks on the door. But I do also think that is. I'm hearing that normally when you do a by-election, you kind of know your safe core voters, your waverers, there's the people you don't bother with. I'm told that Burnham really did want this to start off as being we speak to everybody. He apparently wants to have knocked on every door. And apparently, even now, he's going after the waverers, feeling, and he himself wants to have this direct conversation with them. I mean, he was actually sitting down with groups of voters in Gorton and Denton. He wasn't even standing there, but he was, which, by the way, logistically is horrendously difficult and very unusual and very expensive, and you normally can't do it. But it's a sign of the stakes of this. And I'm sure, likewise, from what we can see, Reform are doing that too. I mean, Nigel Farage is certainly being even more vocal lately as well on this. So I think there is something to be read into the nature of this campaign. Is if you're going that hard, it seems to me that Andy Burnham, and quite understandably, would like to win big because the bigger the margin of his victory, the more momentum that would then ultimately push him into number 10 Downing Street. Politics is all about momentum. And equally for Reform, what we see in some recent polling is that their voters tend to be the highest turnout voters. The people most motivated to turn out are Reform voters. There may be fewer of them in a seat, but they may be more motivated to turn out. So you've got, again, quite an interesting approach to this extremely high stakes election where, I mean, I can't imagine anything like it, but that people are getting knocks on their doors, and your candidate is there, will chat with you for half an hour to try and change your mind. I mean, is that what you're also seeing and hearing, Rob?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, Helen. And I think it's interesting because I think there's a Burnham specific reason for this, but also I think it's potentially Labour learning the lessons from what
Mm,
they've seen in a couple of the other recent by-elections. So, Burnham is very proud of the fact that he wins big and broad in his mayoral contests. He hasn't ever settled, he could easily have just won like 55% Bosh in no problem, but he has made a lot of, seeking to win across the length and breadth of a quite diverse metro area. I think in
mm,
one of the mayoral elections, possibly the last one, he claimed he won every single ward but one or something like that across the
mm,
whole
yeah.
metro area.
Pretty
So
significant. It's
yeah,
quite an
so
astonishing statistic.
so he has always thought, I want to win everyone everywhere. I want to be a big and broad leader with a big and broad mandate. So I think that's a philosophy he's brought to this seat. But
Mm,
it's also, I think, a little bit making a virtue of necessity because one of the things that I think the banana skins Labour slipped up on, particularly in Runcorn, but also to some extent in Gorton and Denton as well, is in Runcorn, I heard quite a lot that they felt they had turned their vote out. And when you look at their vote number, you can see why that was a number they thought was going to win if you made typical assumptions about turnout drops that we talked about. It
yeah.
didn't happen because a whole bunch of people who don't normally vote in a by-election showed up and
Mm,
completely upset their models.
yeah.
Gorton and Denton, they also claimed that they were pretty close, and I think they weren't just spinning it, they were being sincere. And again, the vote share was way lower than they expected, and the turnout was way higher. So I think the lesson they're learning is that they can't really predict who's going to show up in
Yeah.
these kinds of contests.
Yeah.
And so therefore, just going like blunderbuss rather than sort of seeking the kind of rapier approach that they've normally done, the hyper targeting Morgan McSweeney approach. Find your 10% of the electorate that you can persuade and just talk to them. They've realised that that model's not working for them at the moment, so they, particularly in the by-election when they can just really throw everything at it, they might as well throw everything at everyone and hope for the best.
That
On
makes
the other
sense.
side of the coin, that may help neutralise the advantage that Reform seems to have had in terms of higher turnout voters, because although Reform will also be very active in the seat, Reform are still a less organised outfit. They've got less intelligence, less past information to go on, less data, and so on than Labour. So a blunderbuss approach is always the approach that they take. Maybe it helps a little bit if you hear from both sides, or
Yeah.
maybe alternatively, maybe you get really annoyed with all these people constantly knocking on your door and so on. So it's,
Yeah.
I mean, the one other thing we haven't talked about, Helen, though, on the reform side is, of course, we've got the Restore Party
Aha. Yes.
also
Go
kick off.
tell us. Talk. This is very interesting. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, the big surprise from the one constituency poll that we've had so far was Restore in third place on 7%.
Mm.
which is larger than the gap between Labour and Reform in that poll, which would suggest Restore, who, for those who don't know, are a splinter group founded by Rupert Lowe, who was expelled from Nigel Farage's party for being too extreme, and seems very much to have decided that, that level of extremism was not the end point, it was the start point. He's now probably the most extreme politician we've ever had in the House of Commons. He's talking about mass deportation of millions of people as a sort of policy platform, um, and he's backed very heavily by Twitter's owner Elon Musk.
Mm.
Um, so a lot of his activists appear to be on the ground, and in a seat like Makerfield, that is potentially quite interesting because if you go deeper into Makerfield's electoral history, back to the late 90s, early 2000s, what you see in some of these wards is quite a substantial BNP vote. So I
Oh.
said that UKIP never did particularly well here. That's true. The BNP did have some pretty high ward level vote shares in some of these wards 20 odd years ago. So a more openly sort of racial nationalist far right vote, that there might be some of that around
Mm.
for Restore to appeal to. And that is a huge problem for Farage and Reform because any vote that goes into the Restore column was only ever going to go to one of two other places. Either they were going to sit the election out or they were going to vote Reform. These are not voters that were ever really going to be um,
Yeah.
gettable for Labour. So every single vote that those Restore activists managed to win over is a mounting headache for Reform. And here again, the unusual psychology of this by-election could play a role. Because imagine you're a very hacked off Reform voter and you think that Reform are now becoming a kind of Tory light. You're not very happy about seeing people like Jenrick and Braverman on the
Mm.
TV all the time. You were told Nigel was against those kinds of people, and now they're all parading around in your new party's colour. It's a sellout. It's weak sauce, as the Restore people like to say about Reform. You're thinking in this by-election, well, if Burnham wins, Starmer gets kicked out anyway. I don't like Starmer, but I also get to send a message to Nigel Farage that he's letting down the core Reform vote. That Reform losing this by election might be a good way to send a message to Reform that they're not listening to their own voters. So the
Mm.
big dynamic that Reform have been capitalising on for several years now of you're not listening to us, you're too far away from us, you've got too into the Westminster game, you've sold out your true values. That's the argument Rupert Lowe is now prosecuting against Nigel Farage. And this might be a seat where it works
Mm.
simply because for some Reform voters, they feel like they can have their cake and eat it too. They can get
Yeah.
Starmer out, which Reform was telling them a month ago is the thing they should want, and they could send a message to Nigel Farage.
Yeah, not often actually voters, as you say, would get a win-win. Usually they do have to make a choice. Fascinating that the point about some historical BNP voting. You mean in local elections at ward
Yeah.
level? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any particular areas that people should look for when you break down the seat? The demography, or I'll give you a moment to maybe look at that. I don't know, but that is, I mean, we're going to, I believe, I'm sure we will get more constituency polls. I know it's only 2 weeks to go, but we will, which
We will.
may in themselves affect behaviour. That's the slightly quirky nature of these things. When you start to get people tactically voting, as you say, either to send a message or to stop something, so there is that could add a bit of fuel onto the fire. There will be some unhappy Labour voters who desperately don't want reform. So if it looked like reform were doing better, then they may actually be more motivated to turn out for Labour. So these polls will be important. Do you, just I wanted to ask about Restore. They did do well in the Great Yarmouth local
Mhm.
elections, didn't they? They got quite I think all their candidates were elected. Is that
Yeah,
right?
they basically prevented Reform from getting a majority on Norfolk County Council because
Right.
they won every single seat in Lowe's constituency, which I must say, I mean, it's so much happened in those local elections that a lot's been forgotten about, but that's a really remarkable result.
Yeah.
The BNP never achieved anything like that. And it's important constantly to reiterate that, although Rupert Lowe is a posh bloke who ran a football club once. The politics he's espousing are the politics of the far right. They're the politics of the BNP and Nick Griffin. And so a result like that is really quite stunning, actually, to win every single ward they stood candidates in. It's probably what's given them the confidence to really go hard at this by-election, thinking they'd make an impact. Because we had a kind of extreme right spoiler candidate standing Gorton and Denton, someone who'd previously been in Reform and had actually run in mayoral contests and got reasonable shares of the
Mm.
vote. I said he was someone who was worth watching, and he basically got nowhere.
Mm.
The Restore story seems to be somewhat different, and I do suspect it's partly reflected to the fact that Lowe has built up a remarkably big social media
Yeah.
profile, not just on Twitter that we all talk about a lot, but also, and probably more significantly for the kinds of voters he's appealing to, on Facebook. Has millions of followers on Facebook.
Mm.
Who, and these are the kinds of people who have bought into messaging about don't trust politicians, they'll sell you down the river, being sold to them by Farage for years, and now they're hearing actually the politician they need not to trust who's selling them down the river is in fact Farage himself. So it's definitely a thing to watch. And I mean, if, for example, Restore were to get a double-digit vote share or something like that, it would be concerning for a couple of reasons. It's concerning on its own because it suggests a kind of far-right politics is gaining traction here that's really quite ominous in terms of what they're arguing for. But also it's concerning because of what it will do to the internal arguments in Reform. It will generate a lot of pressure to go in that direction within Reform as well, because they'll point at Makerfield and said this was our chance to basically take out the potential next leader of the Labour Party and really stamp our authority on this Parliament. And we've whiffed it, and we've whiffed it because of Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe is our problem now.
Well, and I hate to mention this, but I'm only going to mention it in political strategy terms. But of course, there's been a huge outcry over this terrible murder
Mm.
of this young man, Henry Novak. And look, by-elections can do in your if we look at it purely in political science perspective, um, does can an event change the course of a voting in a by-election, or actually there's a lot of heat and but not much light, and in the end of the day it doesn't have that much impact, or what do you think?
I think it will definitely feature, and I think Burnham's response to it, which we're anticipating we're going to get today, his sort of minders have trailed that he is going to put out a response today. That shows that he reckons it's an
Mm,
issue that needs to be wrestled with, and it will be a pretty crucial test of his communication skills, which are of course like the center of his brand appeal in terms of I'm going to be a better Labour leader. On the policy side, we haven't really heard a great deal, but the idea is he's a guy who can get voters to understand and relate to complicated, difficult issues. Well, here you go, Andy.
yeah,
Day 5 or whatever of the by-election contest. This is as difficult as it gets. So we're going to see how he does on that. And I think that some of the ways in which this issue is being discussed are stick in the throat a bit because it's politicizing and polarizing a
yeah,
family tragedy in a way that the family have explicitly said they don't want to see. But politics is politics. That was always going to happen, unfortunately, given how polarized these issues have become. And I honestly don't know how it will pan out. Again, it's one of those situations where, I mean, one of my favorite books, Helen, is Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer, which is a book by the guy who invented The Strength of Weak Ties, whose name I've now forgotten. I'll remember it in a bit. But one of the arguments he makes is that in social science, we constantly get told, oh, it's obvious when we explain something.
yeah,
But in a situation like this, there's two explanatory narratives we could lay out, and one of them will be right in 2 weeks, but we don't know which one's right now. It could be that issue and that argument about anti-white racism, about double standards in the police, really catches fire for reform amongst voters. It crystallizes a sense of resentment and alienation and ends up really boosting them. On the other hand, it could be that the scenes of violence and chaos that we saw in Southampton also this week crystallize amongst a different set of voters the sense that what reform is bringing is polarization and chaos, and they need to be stopped at all costs.
yeah,
Now, either or both of those things could happen.
yeah.
It's very high stakes for both campaigns because both campaigns know either or both of those things could happen, but we just don't know how voters are going to weigh and react to those different competing narratives yet.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm going to wrap up. We've cantered through all of this. My goodness me, but it's such an important by-election. We just had to dig in. We had to go through it all. I was going to ask you who you think was going to win, but yeah, I can see you're not going to give me that. You're not going
Not
to give
this
me that.
time, not this time. No,
No,
no.
look, well, I am because that's the world that we work in. We have to. So look, our analysis is that Burnham will win and win convincingly,
Mhm.
and that will then catapult him into number 10. That the sort of pressure valve will be off, and the speed will be much quicker than people think, because you just kind of can't sit around inert for weeks on end while everyone tries to deal with an old cabinet that's going to be replaced by a new cabinet. The government itself will need to function. So I think the transition will be much quicker than expected. I think we will have a Burnham Prime Minister. We will then likely have somebody like Ed Miliband, possibly Yvette Cooper, as the Chancellor, and that will, we'll be talking about what's going to be in that budget. Certainly for my client base, that's what they'll be focused on, in terms of what will be in that budget, which could well come, relatively quickly. You've got to give the OBR their 10-week forecast period. But I think we're in a very, very unusual moment right now. Of course, the World Cup's about to begin. Summer holidays are about to begin. I'm sure people are sick and tired of politics. Everyone's sick and tired of everything. Oh, and of course, the small matter of boats stuck in the Middle East and huge cost shock coming through food prices and petrol and diesel and naphtha and everything else. So I get it, but we need to be dispassionate, and that's how we talk to our clients. And we're saying, look through that and see that we're looking at, 3 months from now, a Burnham, the Burnham supremacy, if you like, is what we need to be looking at. I don't know how many versions of the Bourne Identity we'll get with Andy Burnham, but anyway, we kind of need to be prepared for that. But the next 2 weeks will be fascinating. I mean, yeah, it's just under two, just over two. Actually, when will we get the result? Where do you think we get the result, Rob? Will it be overnight?
It will be probably around dawn if the turnout is high as we're expecting it will
Right.
be. So sort of 4 or 5 in the morning. So people will be waking up to if they're early risers, they'll be waking up to it. Well, actually, Helen, on what you just said, one thing I would make a prediction about, that I would agree with you on, is that I do think if Burnham wins, the transition will be quicker than people are anticipating. I agree. The holding pattern we're in now is not satisfactory
Yeah.
for anybody, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if we almost end up with a kind of uncontested coronation. People forget that
Yeah.
most of, not maybe not most, but certainly at least about half of the prime ministerial or leadership transitions have ended up being uncontested. And
Or
I'm
ever. Well, I mean, no, in modern
well,
history.
in the kind of modern era, I
Yeah.
mean, Sunak was, Brown was, May was.
Mm,
Some of them were not necessarily expected to be, but they
yeah.
were. Nobody necessarily in the Labour Party, regardless of their factional interests, wants to drag things out for 3 months with the membership and so on. So
Yeah.
it may be that we end up with a relatively swift transition. I think
All
that's
right.
what.
Well, we'll leave you with that. People need to digest that. Get ready. Get ready for Burnham in number
Feel
10
the burn.
in the next few weeks. Good. Rob, thank you so much. That's been wonderful. Great to hear from you. Please do check out his Substack, The Swingometer. He'll be on your TV screens as the new Sky News Elections Analyst as well. So we look forward to that. And thank you for your time, Rob.
No, my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.